Alright, so let's continue where we left off the previous live lab, right? So I'm just going to go to my Explorer here. I'm not going to use the live server as I've mentioned before, because live server just makes changing things really fast, so we are not going to notice it. Just to recap what we have done, I think we have reached this far, right? I did this with you, and we have changed the text here, right? And we also did change the inner HTML. We made this italic, right, without changing the content. We have changed the styles as well, but the problem with this style thing that we have done, if you remember here, we were working on DOM.js, right? So I'm just going to open, it's open there, right? So changing inner text, we have done this, inner HTML, and there was another one with inner HTML too. That was your exercise, I guess. Then there was the changing the styles, right? So changing the styles was actually targeting an ID of illustration 3. So let's just go to this one. I think this is illustration 3, right? So this is illustration 3. So we targeted this ID, right? And what we did is that when we targeted this ID, we gave it this kind of element. We said get that element with that ID, give it a style, color, font size, and text decoration. And these are the styles that we have given it, right? And then we called that function. I'm just recapping what we did in the previous lecture, right? What's really bad about this way of doing things that we are going to solve in just a minute is that whenever you use the property style, then color, or whatever CSS rule that you want to use, if you take a look at the element after implementing or after running this function, which is change styles, take a look at the element now, you're going to see that these styles, which is color red, font size, text decoration, it's the same things that we have injected using JavaScript to that element that we have grabbed, right? So the problem with this is that any elements or any styles, any CSS rules that you want to inject into that element is being injected as inline styles. You see, these are inline styles. If you don't remember what does inline styles mean, just go to lab 2, right? We had inline styles, we had internal styles, right? So internal styles where you define your styles within the same HTML document inside the style tag, right? So that was inline. This is internal, right? And we had external, of course, when you want to link your styles in another different CSS file, right? So bottom line is that this kind of styling, right? So style.color or style whatever, this adds style to the element that you are grabbing in an inline style manner. It adds this, or it injects these styles to be inline, and that's really annoying. If you remember or talk about inline styles, it's something that you can't really easily change, and it's going to mess up your entire HTML document afterwards. You wouldn't be able to change it really easily. So how can we change some styles of some element without really using this technique, without really using the style property? Is there another way to do that without really relying on JavaScript by injecting styles into an HTML document? Can we do that without really relying on JavaScript with injecting these styles? Well, there is a way to do it instead of using the .style property. We are going to see this in a moment. Let's just recap what we've done. We've reached this part, and I think you did this on your own, okay? And I think we did the developer tools training where I told you to change the TKH logo into this image, or whatever kind of image that you want to do, just to get your hands comfortable in working on the developer tools here, because this is a very useful tool, as I mentioned. So I'm just going to do this with you, and I'm going to do this exercise 1, right? And just one last thing to mention is that the folder that I am working on, which is the JS DOM, which is inside illustration, that you should have copied and pasted in your working directory, I just added an image there, right? This image, for those people, yeah, this is the logo here. This image, for those who didn't or who did actually work with me in the previous online lecture, you wouldn't see it in your directory, but I'm just going to update this in Moodle, so you can just download the newer version, right? Or you can just grab this image and put it in your working directory. However, let's just continue this. So let's go with the developer tools things, because I wanted to show you how can you chain multiple query selectors, how can you just connect multiple get element by IDs together, or get element by whatever selector together, right? So let's just go to Moodle, right? And I'm going to show you something really new. It's not that new. It's called get elements by tag name, right? We have seen get element by ID, but there is something called get elements by tag name. So let's just see how this is looking like. Something is really weird with my browser. So let me just close this. Okay, come on. All right, here we go. Okay, so now we want to change this image, right, to, for example, the image that we have here. Where is it? The image that we have here. And this image, I actually gave you the source for it, right? So I'm just going to copy this and go there. So this is the image that we are working on, right? So let's see how can we grab that element. So I'm just going to inspect element to this image, and you can see that the image, it doesn't really have any special IDs or classes. So how can we grab this image, right? It doesn't have an ID. Omar in the previous lecture, he just came up with the idea of how about we just add a volatile ID like this, like logo, image, anything that we know, right? So we added an ID here. So if we have an ID, we can use our beloved get element by ID here, and let's just say logo image, right? So what did we call it? Logo image. Yeah, it's an underscore. Okay, so this should get you the image directly, right? And we can just save this in a variable and just call it, for example, image. All right, so that is the image here. Okay, now we can access the source by using just .source, because the source property is one of these properties, as you've seen in the previous lecture, that you can access directly like .source, right? Some other properties or attributes cannot be accessed like that, so instead you use what's called as get attribute. And get attribute, you just pass the attribute that you want to get, which in this case it's source. It's the same thing as saying .source, but get attribute works for every other attribute. But using the dot operator and just saying .source or whatever, it won't work for every attribute out there, right? So this is the source. So it's going to give you the default image, which is this case, it's this image here, right? So now we want to reassign it to update it. So I'm just going to take this one, right, and just paste it there with double quotes, of course. And here you go. This is the image, right? Of course, if I refresh this, everything is going to be removed, right? So instead of adding an ID, how about we do something different? How about we grab this image like literally by grabbing the image tag without using IDs? So there's something called document.getElement by tag name, or get elements by tag name. So it's an inst there, so just notice this, because it might give you some syntax error, right? So get elements by tag name, and you can pass the tag of the element that you are searching for, or the elements that you are searching for, since this is going to be multiple elements. And you can actually tell that the ID is a unique kind of selector, because get element by ID, it doesn't have the S there, it's just get element. So this is implying that anything that has a specific ID, it shouldn't be repeated over the places. You should not copy the ID and put it in multiple elements, because as you know, as you're seeing here, an ID should be unique. So an element that has an ID of logo, that element should only have the ID of logo. You should not repeat that ID to other elements, right? I hope this is clear now. Okay, so this is get elements by tag name, and this is literally getting you an array here, a list. And as you can see, this is a bracket, right? So this is a bracket. If you watch the previous video, the previous part, you're gonna see that this is an array or a list in JavaScript. So we can expand this actually from where? We can expand this from here, and you can see all of the images that you have in this page. So we have multiple images. So this is the first image, the second, the third. So we can grab the first image, which is, it has an index of 0, and this is going to get you the logo of the Knowledge Hub, right? So let me just hit arrow up, right? And this is get elements by tag name. This is going to get you the elements that has the tag image inside of them. So this is retrieving all of this. We just want the first one, which is index of 0. So this is going to get you the first logo here, right? So I'm just going to save this in a variable, and now we have the image tag, right, using the document.get elements by tag name. We're not using the .get element by ID anymore, right? So I'm just saying this because you should have like multiple variety of tools that you can use in your hand. It doesn't have to be always get element by ID, right? It can be anything that works, right? So I'm just going to copy this, and we get the same result. Last thing, and this is I think this is the first part. So we did change the logo using get element by tag name. Now we can change the logo via chaining query selectors, right? So how can we chain query selectors? The previous time this didn't work with me because there was a simple mistake that I didn't notice at the end of the lab. So I'm just going to redo this really quick. Now let's say that I'm just going to inspect this element. All right, so this element is there. It's an image tag, right? And I don't want to use get elements by tag name, and I don't really want to use get element by ID. So what can I use? Well, if you look at the parent element here, which is the span, for some reason the developers of the TKH website has included this image inside a span, right? So if we have the span element as a parent, maybe I can get to the child element, which is the image, right? So if I have the parent span, we can get there. So how can we get this guy? Well, fortunately, this guy has a attribute of class. So it has a class, or it actually has multiple classes. See this white space? This is a separator. This means that this span has class 1, it has class 2, and it has class 3. So let's grab the first, let's grab this span using the first class, which is the class logo here, right? So you've seen document.get element by ID and by tag name. There is also get elements by class name, right? And as well, because class can be shared across multiple elements, it's not that unique, you know. That's why they're saying get elements by class name. So multiple elements can have the same class all over the place, as we've mentioned before, right? So let's search for an element that has the class logo, and fortunately it's going to return to you that span, right? This span, the parent that has the image inside, right? So let me just say that I'm going to save this inside a span, and that span should return to me the parent that has the image. And if you we don't really need to expand this, but let's just start to chain things, and let's say that if I have this span, I can say get element by tag name, and this is where things are going to be ugly. This is the problem that we have faced inside the previous lab. So if you did something like this, it's gonna tell you that this span, it doesn't have a tag name called tag, or a tag name called image. So what is going on here? Well, simply because when we were choosing the tag name or the class name of that element of that span, right? If you click on this, you're gonna see that this actually returns an array. It returns a list. So this means that we need actually to find which element inside that list that really represents that span. So again, this is just an array. This is just a list of multiple things. But if you want the actual span element, it's inside index of 0. So we needed to do something like this. So this is going to be always targeting that span. You can see that it's literally returning to you the span part, right? Or the span parent element. So now we just can save this in a variable called span again, right? And this is the part that I forgot in the previous lecture, right? So we can now say span.get element by what do you want? Let's say get element by tag name, and let's search for the image inside that parent span, and this is going to be returning multiple images or an array as usual, because this is the nature of how get elements by class name or get elements by tag name work. It retrieves multiple elements regardless of if it did find multiple elements or it just found one element. This is how it works. It returns a list of elements, whether actually there were a list inside that or multiple elements inside that list, or whether it was only there was only one element inside that list, right? So it happens here that we have only one element at index 0, but this is the nature of the function or the method. This is how the method is implemented. It returns multiple things. So that's why it returns an array. So we can do the same stuff because we know the drill now. So this returns a list, and we just need the first element of that list, which is the 0 index, right? And we can save this in a new variable, call it image, right? And once we have that image, we can just say that we are going to paste that link, and here we go. All right. All right, so let's go to example 1 here, right? So example 1 is saying in this specific element, I think this is an h2, right? So that's an h2. It's saying that we are going to run some function whenever this website actually is being opened, right? So whenever we click on reload, there's some kind of a pop-up or alert that is going to be happening, and it's going to ask me, are you the specific user? And if I confirmed, then it's going to welcome me. So instead of this text, it's going to say welcome Ahmed, for example, right? And if I wasn't that user, then it's going to say just access denied, right? We've done something like this, similar to this at the beginning of the lab, the previous lab, right? And if we go to the manual here of the lab, I think we did, it was called confirm name, where we asked the user for his name, and if he confirms that the name is correct, then it alerts welcome name, but this alert is just like a pop-up box right there, right? Otherwise it alerts like access denied. It's the same function that we are going to build. It's called confirm name for DOM. The only difference is that if the user confirms his name, this is going to be showing the name here instead of this text. So it's going to say welcome Ahmed, for example. And if he didn't confirm, this is going to be showing access denied. Instead of using the alerts, we won't use the DOM here. And by DOM, I just mean that we want to manipulate the HTML part or HTML elements using the JavaScript. Okay, so if you did the confirm name function in the previous lab, I think the edit is really simple. So instead of, if the user confirms, instead of alerting, we are just going to return the username, right? And if the user did not confirm, right, so it's instead of alerting access denied, it's going just to return false, right? Then the validation here is the same, no empty strings. And if there is an empty string, it should also return false, all right? So let's just see, where did we implement this? We implemented this in a script called jsfile.js, right? So that was the file that we've done in the previous lab, but we commented it out because we didn't need it anymore, right? And as I've mentioned in the previous lab, you can implement, or you can use multiple JavaScripts in your HTML document. You don't have only to have one. It's totally fine, right? So in the JavaScript file, we had the function called confirm name. So I'm just going to copy this, and since we don't really work on that file, we are working on the DOM, the JS script. This is what we are linking here. So I'm just gonna go there and paste this, and it's the same thing. So enter your name. This is the prompt. If the variable was not an empty string, that means that the user has entered something, right? Then we are going to confirm on him. If are you the specific person? If he was that specific person, instead of alerting, we're just going to return that user's name, right? And else, if he wasn't, then we are just going to return false, right? And the same thing, if the name was an empty string, then we are just going to also return false, right? So there's no, it's the same thing. We didn't actually do anything different here, okay? So that's the same function. Now I'm just going to rename this into for DOM, like that. Let me just make this capital letters, right? And now we can use this to say that we are going to run this function. All right, so once this function is ran, it's going to be returning the name based on the confirmation, or it's going to be returning false or false, right? So how about we try to run this? Let's just try to run this just to see how this is looking like. So I'm just going to call confirm name function, and I'm going to call it, and whatever this is going to be returning, which is either the name or false, is going to be logged to the console. So I'm just going to run this, and let's just refresh. And let's say that my name is Ahmed. Are you Ahmed? Yes, I am. So let's go to console, and it's going to log this part. So what happens if I entered an empty string? It returns false. So what happens if I entered something like this and that wasn't my name? So cancel is going to return false. All right. So using this information, we can use whatever is being returned to actually update this part, right? So this is, if we go to inspect element, this is an h2 that has an ID of illustration example, right? So I'm just going to say Notice that you can call the function from the DOM, from the developer tools, from the browser, because as I've told you in the previous lecture, anything that you define in your HTML and JavaScript, right? So anything that you define in this HTML document and anything that gets linked to that HTML document, right, it can be identified by the browser, right? So we can try to call this function from the browser like this, and it's going to give you the same exact result. See, whenever you hit enter, the same exact result, right? So now let's say that I want to grab this element, and that's an h2 that has an ID of illustration example. So let's just say document.getElement by ID, and let's say that I'm going to grab that element, right? So this is going to return this element right there, right? One would ask, why are we using the developer tools? Why don't we just write this in our JavaScript file? This is because personally I like to try things out in my developer tools before I write anything in my script, right? Just as for testing purposes. Okay, so I can just save this in let's call it, what do we call it? Let's call it h2, right? So this is the h2 that we have grabbed, right? And now we can say that I am going to put this inside a function, right? So if I'm going to put this inside a function, now this is the perfect time for me to go and put this code in my JavaScript file, because for me testing is like trying multiple methods, like try this method or try that method, and that's it. This is where I personally use the console in, right? But whenever it comes to big chunks of code and writing functions, I think this is going to be really cramped if you write things in the browser. So you can just write it in the JavaScript here, because now we are writing a function, and this is a larger piece of code. That's like a block of code. So anyways, let's just make a function and call it grab h2. All right, you can call it whatever you want. So in this function, I'm just going to grab that h2 that has the illustration example ID. Right? Once I have this, I'm going to call that function, right? So I'm going to have this function returning something. So I'm just gonna say that I will call that function, right? So let's say that once this is ready, once grab h2 is ready, I'm going to call confirm for DOM, right? So this is how things are going to look like. Okay, so this means that grab h2 actually takes a parameter here. So this is the parameter. Notice that this is going to be, this highlighted part is going to be returning either true or the name or false. So it's either going to be returning something like this, or it's either going to be returning something like this. This is what matters to me, right? So either way, I just care about the value that this is going to be returning. Okay, so in programming, if we saw something like this, you know for sure that the inner function executes first, then the outer function executes next. So once this inner function is executing or has done executing, it's going to be returning again name or false. So let's say that this is going to be value, right? So this function is going to be, this function here, whenever we call it, it's going to be returning either name or either false. So this, by the end of the day, value is going to be having either a name or either false, right? This is what we really care about, okay? So knowing this information, I can start my if statement. I can say, well, if value was actually there, right? So if value was not equal to false, right? We can do the following. If it was not equal to false, that means that the user has actually entered a name there, right? So let's say that if it was not equal to false, then we are going to take that value and update the inner text of that h2 element that we grabbed by it, right? So I'm just going to put that there, right? Else, if it was equal to false, that means that the user either entered an empty string, right? Or maybe he did not confirm that the name was correct. Then we are not, maybe we are just going to say inner text access denied. And this should be a string denied, or like that. Okay, so let's try this. Okay, now let's go and refresh, and let's say that Ahmed, and let's say that we are going to confirm. This is going to be returning the value, right? So if it returns the value, this returns the value, right? Grab h2 is going to take that value, and if it is not equal to false, I'm just going to update inner text, right? So let's try to enter something that is not correct and say that is my name. No, this is not my name, so cancel. It's going to tell you access denied. What if we enter something empty as well, access denied? Okay. All right. So your challenge here is actually to add a red color to this access denied phrase. So that's not even hard, right? So I'm just going to do this there. Okay. So let's go to my script. Okay. So if it was access denied, I'm just going to add a style. I know that I've just mentioned that the style property, using the style like this, is going to inject the styles as inline styles, and this is not something that is not recommended. But for the time being, let's just work with this, and I'm going to show you the best way of doing or of adding styles using JavaScript into your HTML elements. What an annoying word to say. So I'm just going to say that I'm not going to enter anything. Let me just try to refresh this. Empty string. Here we go. Right. Enter something that is not you, and do not confirm something. It's the same thing, right? And that's it. That's the whole exercise, right? Now try to do this on your own. It's the same thing that I've just done, right? Now let's see what is the best way to actually give styles or inject styles using JavaScript into an HTML element. So the idea here is, instead of using JavaScript to inject inline styles using the style property, right? We can just replace an existing class. Let's say that we have an element, right, that has a specific class, right? And all you are going to do using JavaScript is not inject styles using this property, but you are going to reassign an existing class, right? So let's say that we have already other class defined, right, in our CSS file, right, called another class, right? So this guy has a specific class. We don't really care about the old class, right? But we want to override that class with another existing class that we have already defined also, right? So we can use the set attribute. Now we can use a combination of get and set attribute methods together, and we're going to see how can we do this. But the idea here is that you grab that set attribute, and let's say that set attribute class, you are targeting the attribute class, and you are reassigning it with the new value here. This is the second argument, is the new value, right? So the second argument is whatever you are passing here, and you want to reassign the existing class with, right? So let's see an example of that. Okay, so I've made a couple changes first here. You're gonna see these updates on the file, the same files on Moodle. So yeah, so if you open the script that I've just uploaded to Moodle, the ones that you have downloaded in the previous lab, you should see there was an h1 green. I've just changed this to h2 green. It's the same CSS rule, just call it green, and I've added another class that shares the same CSS rule, h3 green. So this h3 green and h2 greens, you should see them here in this h2 element and in this h3 element. So these are just a couple of changes that I've made. All right, so anyways, let's see how can we grab this element. So this is the first exercise here, to grab this element and change the current class that it has to the h2 red class. And you might wonder, where is that h2 red? You can see that there's an h2 green, right, which is the class that this element is actually having, but there is no h2 red, and this is the one that we are going to customly create in just a moment. So let me just inspect this element, and you can see that this element is in fact an h2. It has an h2 green, right? So we want to override this with an h2 red. So let's just define in our CSS style sheet what is the h2 red, what should it has of CSS rules. So I'm just gonna say h2 red, and by the way, you can define this h2 red whether it's in your CSS workspace. So let's say that I am defining my CSS in the style, in an internal style tag, right? So I'm going to write the h2 red there. If you have an CSS external file, right, and you are linking it to your HTML document, you can define it there. It's totally fine. It's going to work whether it's an external CSS file or an internal CSS tag, right? It's still totally your call on this part. So I'm just going to say that this h2 red is going to have a background color of red, right? So the h2 green is having a color green, and the h2 red is having a background color of red. Now we can do the following. Let's just grab this element and just inspect that element. So it has an ID of illustration 4, and it has as well a class of h2 green. So whatever you want to grab the element with, just use it. So you can just go with document.getElement by ID and say illustration 4, or if you want to use the class, the getElements by class name, and use, but remember that this returns a list, so you can use the h2 green, right? So this returns a list. If you want the specific element, you just need to access that first element or index of 0. So both of them will work. I'm just going to pick the ID one, and let's just say that this is a var h2. So this is my h2 element. Now if I have the h2 element, I can just say that this class property, and notice if you write something like h2.class, it's not gonna appear. So the class attribute is not like the image. Sometimes if you say image.source, the source property is going to appear to you, right? But not all, or the source attribute is going to appear to you, but not all attributes are going to be shown that easily. And one of them is the class attribute. So in these cases we use the get attribute, but remember, I don't want to really fetch that class, I just want to reassign it. So if I want to reassign or update it, I can use the set attribute. The set attribute takes two values or two arguments, as you're seeing here. So it takes a name and a value. The name is the attribute that you want to update. So let's say that I want to update whatever class that this element is typically right now is currently having. So this element is currently having a class attribute of the value of h2 green. Now I want to update that value to be h2 red. And where is that h2 red? Well, basically the h2 red is the class that we have just customly defined in our HTML document or in our style and line style tag, right? So what's going to happen when I hit enter is that whatever value that the class attribute is having is going to be set to the value that we pass as a second argument to this method. So once you hit enter, you should see that, well, this has changed, but there's a problem. Let me just go to this element, and now it has the h2 red, right? You can see that now it has the h2 red, okay, but something is not right. Maybe we have written the background color wrong, so it should have the background color of red. Alright, let me just pause the video for a second. I think that we needed to refresh this. Maybe we didn't refresh the page whenever we have defined the h2 red. I think the browser didn't get updated that we have added a class that's called h2 red, so I think that just a basic refresh is going to do the trick. I'm just going to copy this, and let's refresh this, and let's try again. Okay, so this is our h2 and set attribute, and let's change the class to be I'm just going to remove the color red. Let's just have it as a background red. So let me just do this one more time. So this is the h2 and set attribute. So let's add the h2 red, and here we go. Alright, it works. So the browser wasn't just updated, we needed to do a simple refresh here. Anyways, this is how set attribute works, but if you are noticing something, the previous h2 green has been removed, right? And maybe this is something that you don't really necessarily need to happen. Maybe you want to have two classes, right? So now you can look at the element here. It has the h2 red, right? It doesn't have the h2 green anymore, right? Maybe this is something that you don't entirely need. Maybe you want to use multiple classes on the same element. So multiple classes is something like this. Maybe if I do something like a space and h2 green, now I have both elements, right? Maybe you want to have something like this, to have both classes on the same element. So the color of the font is green and the background is red. If you don't understand what this white space is, I'm sorry about this, I just have a very bad cough these days. If you don't understand what this is, please watch the video for the CSS in the second week, right? So in our case, if I did something like that using set attribute only, it's going to overwrite whatever class that is there. It's not going to have multiple classes, right? So let me just remove the one that I've added there. Okay, like this. So what happens if we want to have both classes? Like I want to update. In this exercise, this is what we are going to see, right? We want to update this current element. So this current element, if you inspect it, it's the illustration 5 ID. It's this h3. It has the class of h3 green, and we want to update this element to have both classes, to have h3 green, and it should have as well the h2 red green, or the h2 red class, right? So I wanted to have a color font, or a font color of green, and as well a background color of red. All right. So if we want to do this, we can easily say that, how about we grab the current class on that ID, or on that element, right? So we will grab the current class, and once we grab the original class that this element has, now we can save it in a variable, and then update that element, or set the class on that element, right, with the new class and the old class as well, both at one time, right? So how can we do that? Let's go there and let's grab this element first. Okay, so this element it has an illustration 5, so I'm just going to say grab the element with illustration 5. So this is, I think this is an h3. So this h3, it has a class of h3 green, right? So if I did something like h3.set attribute, and I just went and said something like class, and update that value with h2 red, it's going to be overwritten. This h3 green is going to be lost, right? And I'm going to be only having h2 red. So instead of doing this, first let's grab the class that the element currently have first. So you can just say h3.get attribute, and this is where get attribute comes to the arena, right? So you can say get attribute, get the current value that the class attribute on that element has, right? So the current value of the class that this element has is called h3 green. That's really good. Now let's save this in a variable. Now let's say that the variable is going to be old class, right? We have done something similar in the previous lab, right? So old class, if you want to inspect it, it has the h3 green. Now we can do the following. We can say that I will set the new attribute for the class property on this element to be the following. It should be the h2 red, right? But if you did this, you're going to only have an h2 red with a background color of red to this element. So how about the old class? And this is where our template literals is going to come in place. So we need to make a new space and do something like h3 green. This is going to be adding two classes at once to this element. So it's going to be adding this value as the first class and this value as the other class, right, to this attribute. And this is going to do the trick. But the problem here is, what happens if you do not know what is the actual name for this h3 green class, right? So maybe the old class is not h3 green. Maybe some developer in your team, or maybe you yourself, you will come to your script and you're going to say that this h3 green class is going to be h3 green with a G, a capital letter G, right? So this is going to mess up your code or your argument here. Okay, so instead of using static values, we can just use the old class that we have grabbed using the get attributes. I'm just going to revert to the original one. So instead of using a static value for the old class, I'm just going to use a template literal using the backticks instead of the double quotes, right, with a $sign before the curly braces, and I'm going to put my old class here, and this should work, but it didn't because we have messed up the other backtick. So the backtick is for the second argument, right, but the first argument, which is class, is the same, right? So now we're gonna see that the h3 element now has the color of the green CSS rule, right, which is basically the old, that's the old h3 green class, and it has the background color of red, which is the new h2 red class, right? And if you went to the element, you're gonna see that this element now, this one, it has the new two classes that we have added using this trick of grabbing an element using get attribute and setting the new class that we need, as well as the old class in conjunction by separating them with a white space. All right, so let me just refresh that. Now if we want to write a function that does this from my JavaScript file, I'm just going to say a function, and I'm literally going to do the same stuff that we have done before. So let's say using change styles, and let's say get and set attributes. Okay, using this method, or let's just say method 1. Okay, so now we are going to grab the h3 element, and I'm going to say document dot get element by ID, and let's choose the illustration 5. I'm just going to do the next one, this one, right? We've seen that this is already, this just to overwrite something and forget about the old value, you can just use the set attribute. I'm going to use both in this one to reserve the old one and as well add the new one. All right, so now we can just say that we are going to document dot, or not document, I'm sorry, on this element we want to get the old attribute that the class property has, and I'm going to save it in all class. I'm having some typo issues. Old class. Now once we have the old class, we can just say that now set the new class using set attribute, right? So we are going to set the attribute for the class to be a template literal using the backticks, right? And we should add the new class, which is the h2red for the background color, space to add another multiple class, and I'm going to add the $sign here and old class, and this should do the trick. Now let's call this function change styles method 1, and let's refresh, and here you go. Okay, you can see that it's having both, right? Okay, let's see the best way of changing styles. All right, so this is going to work for any attribute. It doesn't have only to be the class attribute. This can work for any attribute, whether it's a class, an ID. I can't think of anything else, to be honest, but it can work with any attribute. This get and set attribute, right? But for classes specifically, if you are doing your styles or giving styles to your elements via classes, right, which this should be the case if you are doing the CSS classes or styles correctly, because the convention is we give styles to elements via classes, not any other attribute, not like an ID or anything, right? So if you are giving styles via classes, like to elements, right, so you can use something called a class list, and this is a very modern way, right, for updating classes, adding new classes to already defined classes without overwriting anything. So let me just show you how we can do this using the this element here, right? So I'm just going to use the console for this one. Let me just inspect this, right? So we have the illustration 6, and now how about we add an h1 or h2red class to this one, okay, without using the get and save it in a variable and use set attribute to update it with the old one. We can just use the class list, right? So this has an ID of illustration 6, so I'm just going to grab this first. Okay, illustration 6, and that's an h2 and not an h3, so I'm just going to update the variable here. So this h2, it has an h1 green, right? Well, how about we just update this, because we don't really have an h1 green in our HTML. We have an h2 green, so I'm just going to update this one. Where is it? Illustration 6. So this should have an h2 green. So now this is a green one, okay? All right, so let's grab this one, the h2 here, and it has the h2 green class. Now we can just say the following. We can just say class list, right? And we can just say add. it's literally that simple, okay? So if you want to add a new class to an existing one without removing the existing one, we can just say the method add, and let's add the h2red that we have customly defined here, right? So it has a background color of red. Once you do that, there you go, in just one line. All right, so class list has multiple things. It's not only add, it has so many things. It has something like contains, like you can perform a loop on it. I didn't give you the for each, but it's like the same concept of a for loop. What do we have? We can remove a specific class, right? We can replace if you want to overwrite, if you are strictly you want to overwrite, so we can use replace. It's like the set attribute from before. You can have toggle, right? So let's try toggle here. This toggle is really handful. So let's say that I'm just going to set the h2 red here. So now you are toggling it, right? So once you toggle it, let's say that now it's going to return false. So it's gonna take away the h2 red class, which is the background color. Look at this. Let me just grab this here. I want to have it. I think I can do that, can I? Right, I wanted to divide the console, but however, so if I did this one more time, you can just toggle it to be on. So now it's on, as you're seeing here. Now it's off. So if it's off, it doesn't have the h2 red, right? But if I did this again, it's gonna have this. So it has the h2 red, and so on. Okay, so if you want to make function to do that, that's really trivial, but I'm just going to do it anyway. So let's just say that we have a function, and let's say that change styles, and this is method 2, and this is the best method, right, which is using the class list, right? So instead of these 2 lines, we can just say that this is an h2 and it has an ID of 6. So you can just say h2 class list. This is a camel case notation, so this is a small one, dot add, right? And let's just add h2, right? Okay, and let's call this function. Now let's go there and refresh, and here you go. Okay, one last thing I wanted to add here is the ability to add elements on the spot, right? This is really important. You ever seen this websites that has like a button where it says like if you want to register for a newsletter, or you want to be added to the wish list, or you want to get updates? So whenever you click on the button, it says thank you for registering, or thank you for being a member in our newsletter, or you are going to receive all the news for this website or this service, right? So it's all done using this create element. It's like a 2-board kind of scenario. So it has the element that you want to create, the element that whenever you click on a button, boom, you have a new image. You have like a division that has a paragraph inside of it that says thank you for registering, right? So the first part is to create the element, and the second part is where do you want to inject that element? Do you want to inject it right after the button that you click, before or above the button? Where do you want to inject it to be specific, right? So let's start with creating an element here. So I just want to, this is the new part that I've added. It wasn't there in the document that you have downloaded in the previous online lab, right? So I want to insert an image in this area between this. I think this is an h1. Let me just make sure. This is an h1. There's an h2. So between them, I want to have an image in between. So how can we do that? First of all, let's create the image tag, right? So let's just say document and create element. Where is create element? Here it is, right? So let's say that we will create an image, and notice that the argument that you put here, it should be mapping to an actual HTML element tag. So you can't really make things up in this part. You can just say image. There is no tag in HTML called image. It's called img, right? So this is going to create an image for you. So let's just save it in a variable, and let's say that this is new image, right? So this new image technically doesn't have a place in our HTML layout yet. It's not inserted yet, but it's there. Notice that it doesn't have, it literally doesn't have anything, right? No source, no alternative, width, height, nothing, right? So first of all, let's append that element, or you know what? Let's just add the element source first. So let's add the image that I've included in this folder. Let me just try to. So we had an image here. Where is it? This image, right? So it's, I just downloaded the image. You're gonna see it in Moodle, uploaded in Moodle. So it's image.png, right? So I'm just going to include that image in the source. So this image tag, I can just say that I will say source. You can use the set attribute as well here, but I'm just going to use the source and add that image. It's called image, and it's the same. It's in the same directory as my folder, as my HTML document. So there is no relative paths or anything. So image.png, right? It won't show up yet because we haven't actually injected it anywhere in our HTML document. So now this image is actually kind of ready. It has an image and it has a source, so everything is ready now, right? So we can insert it. Now we can think about multiple ways to do that. I have included in this page after, before, and insert adjacent. Maybe I can add another one, which is append child. I'm just going to pause this. Okay, so we have also append child, and append child was this is the ancient one of them all. That's like from the minute that JavaScript was known as a language, we've seen that append child element. So let's start with append child here. Okay, so I can just say let's append the child to the end of this body, right? So if I just came to the elements and let's see where's the body here. Okay, so this is the body, so I can just append it to the end of the body, right? So let's say document dot body dot append child, right? And let's say that I'm going to append this child, which is the new image tag, right? So let's do this, and you can see that the image has appeared, but at the end of my document. This is not typically what you want to have. What you want to have specifically is to insert the image somewhere, maybe before this tag, maybe before this element, or after this element. You don't necessarily want it to be inserted at the end of your body or HTML document. So let's see how can we use the other methods. Alright, so before we start doing the other methods, I just want to inspect what we have done. So if we went to the body, you're gonna see that, where's the image? Where's the image here? Let me just inspect this. You can see that the image has come to the end of the body, right? Inside, it's appended, so it's inside the body tag, right? So let's try to append it or add it after this element using the same append child, right? So let's say that this element, for example, is called, that's a UL. Oh, that's a U, yeah, that's underlined. So let's say that this element has an H1, right? So let's just give it an ID. So I'm just going to go and give this guy an ID. This H1 should have an ID of add image, right? So let's add image 1, right? So this is the ID of this guy. I'm just going to save this. Go there, refresh, and let's do the same stuff here. Let's just create the image tag. Where is it? Yeah. Now let's add the source. Now let's say that h1 dot or var h1 is going to be having document dot get element by ID, and let's grab the ID of this guy. So now we have the ID of this element. Now we can say append child. We don't want to append it to the body, right? We just want to append it to be after the h1. Notice that I said after, but the append inserted inside. So how is this going to work? Let's see. So we have new image, and you're gonna see that the image it is seemingly under this element. It's seemingly beneath of it, right? But if you just make something like this, you're gonna see that there's something weird here. Now we know that heading tags are block level elements, so they should not be in line. We know that the image is in line, but because this is a block level element, this should come to the underneath of it, right? So if we go to inspect this, you're gonna see something really annoying here, that the append child, it literally nests things inside the target. So my target here was basically the h1. So I'm saying nest this element inside that element to the end, and to the end because this is what append means. Append means add something to the end, right? So the image was successfully added here, but it is inside that h1, right? So this is the opening and the closing of the h1, and the image has been appended inside of it. Maybe this is something you would want to have using append child if you have something like a div, right? Like maybe you have some kind of a div that you want to append images or paragraphs or anything inside of it. But typically in a case like this, I don't want to append the image to the h1, right? So append child wouldn't really work for me. But if you have something like a div, let's say that I'm just going to create a div here, and I'm going to give it something like add image 2, right? And I want to grab this element. I'm just going to make this an ID, right? Or let's just have it a class. It's not going to harm anyone, right? So I want to grab this div and I want to append that image inside of it. Using append child, I can literally do that. So this is the case where you can use append child if you have something like a div, but not like an h1 or any other tag, because divs are typically by nature, they are containers, so they would work for append child perfectly. So let's just refresh this and let's just do the same stuff and create an element first. create an image tag, and assign to that image tag a source of the current image location, image name. And now let's say that I want to grab that div. So I'm just going to say, where is it? Get elements by class name, right? And now I would want to get that div that has an add image to, right? So this is basically a div. So this div, this is the div. Where is it? It doesn't show here, but this is typically returning a list. So your div should be at the first element. So this is our div, but it doesn't have anything inside of it. You can tell that it shows, but there's nothing inside, so it's not visible right now, right? So I'm just going to edit this and let it have our div here. So this div should have an empty div like that, right? So we have successfully targeted it, right? So if I have that div, I can just say append child, and I can give it that new image that I've created. And this is a very beautiful case scenario to show you how can you use append child with divs, right? And it works totally fine. So if I look at the div now, it has the image inside of it, right? It looks a little bit weird, but it works, all right? So if you don't want to use append child, then we have other alternatives. I'm just going to show you after, and I'm going to show you this weird insert adjacent element. This is something typically new. It's really recent. So let's start with after here. Let's say that I want to append an image after this tag, right? So after the h1, and I don't really want to have a div to prepare things for it. So I don't want to add, like, manually go to my script and create a div and prepare a container for the image to be inserted at, right? So you have one of two options. Either if you don't want manually to create a container for your image to be appended in, right? You have one of two options. First, go to your DOM.js or your JavaScript file, create two elements, create a div element, create another image element, and append that div inside, or that image inside that div, and then add the div after this h1, right? This is if you are really insisting on the idea of having the image inside a container, right? If you don't want to have an image inside a container, we can just add the image literally just as it is after that element, using literally the after method. So let me just grab this element using the ID of add image 1. Okay, so let me just refresh this. And let's say that document.get element by ID. And let's grab that h1, var h1. And this is the h1. Now we can just literally say after that h1, I want to add my element, which is the image. So where is the image? Let's just create it first. So let's say that we want to create that image, right? And I want to add the source to it. Where is it? Okay, so I would want to say h1 after, and after that element, I'm just going to add the new image. And this is going to work. The same thing if you wanted to grab that element and use before, for example. Now the last thing that I want to show you is something called insert adjacent element. It looks a little bit weird, right? So here in the documentation we have the target element, like where do you want to insert the image, like after this element, before this element. There's some argument, new argument called the position, and the element that you want to add. So what is the position here? The position has so many things. It has like before begin, after begin. So what are all of these? Let's say that, let's take for example after end, right? So maybe I want to add the image after this element. So I want to say that after this element ends, I want to add the image, and hence the position after ends, right? The same thing goes for before ends and stuff like that. It sounds a little bit confusing, but it's not really that confusing. So let's grab this element, and I want to grab this h1, the same h1 that we have grabbed. So this is the h1 that we are working on, right? And let's create the image tag first. So this is the image tag. Let's add the source to that image, and let's say h1.insert adjacent element. Okay, and I want to say that I will insert it after this element ends. So after end, right? So it's after end here, right? And this is the first argument. The second argument is what is the element that you want to add, and this should give you the same result. Okay, so this is typically all what you need to know about DOM.